We can get through this pretty quickly and then save some time for questions. I'll start and then let Bruce fill in as needed. So we start out just like we have on previous webinars, and I should start by saying we'll definitely continue some version of this, I think. We haven't talked about that. I know Jay mentioned this is the last webinar, and he also said we'll find a way to get everyone information. So just make sure to note that after this week, although we'll, like we said, we'd be stopping the webinar version of this probably, we'll figure out a way, whether that's through a podcast or, an email or some way of getting everyone information on a weekly basis, since stuff is actually heating up quite a lot now. Just so everyone knows, when this is posted on the website, you can click on these links and check out some of the recent news since the last time we chatted. There's coverage of Farm Bureau stops, some interviews, that sort of thing, on the ongoing debate on property versus income tax relief. We wanted to start by just talking about, last week we touched a little bit on LB 640, which came out of the Revenue Committee. It's Senator Groney's bill that caps property taxes as a percentage of school budget. It also repurposes the property tax credit fund to pay for everything. It also lowers the maximum levy for schools. And then there's a formula basically to use those dollars to make schools whole if their school boards vote in the rest of the budget. It's relatively complicated, but overall we really like the mechanism that, especially the idea of limiting property taxes as a percentage of school budgets. That's right in line with the discussions we've been having of limiting property taxes as a percentage of the state's budget overall. Our position on Senator Groney's bill, which is expected on the floor next Tuesday, the 18th, is that we need to find new revenue to fund it. We want to leave the property tax credit fund alone. Even if the new money has to flow through the property tax credit fund to fund this mechanism in 640, we want to leave $224 million in the property tax credit fund to go directly back to ag, residential, and commercial property owners. We also want to phase down the 55% cap on property taxes in school budgets. We'd like to get it down to 35%, which would cover almost all of the school districts in the state. If 40% might be the compromise amendment, but over time we'd like to get down to 35%. That would be consistent with our position. We're going to work really hard next week to make 640 a version that everyone can be happy with. We don't want to just repurpose the property tax credit fund and not get anything out of it. So far, the property tax credit fund has been relatively safe, although we have to defend it every year, and it seems easy to go after. Money hasn't been pulled out of there in 10 years, and in fact, it keeps getting a little more. So it's not the perfect system. It's pretty easy to understand, and it's been pretty difficult for folks to cut. And repurposing it, school aid, as we all know, hasn't been that safe. And if we're going to repurpose it, we want to make sure that we're getting a win, and we don't just want to come out a wash. LB 461 came out of the Revenue Committee last Friday. Wednesday or Thursday. I think it came out of the committee after we had our webinar last Wednesday, since we were still talking about it being in committee. This bill is actually about a 10-to-1 income to property tax bill. It's a $439 million bill. We can add these numbers in before we post this online for everyone. It's a $439 million measure. About $39 million of that, or even a little less, will go to property tax relief via the TIOSA formula. So it's not necessarily a dollar-for-dollar reduction, but that's about the estimate. So really, and then the $400 million would go to lowering the top income tax and the top corporate income tax. That was pretty frustrating for us, and you'll hear that, I think, reflected in some of the interviews and some of the comments if you go back to the news section. This is a compilation of the two bills introduced on behalf of the governor, LB 337 and LB 338. One of those is an income tax reduction bill. The other is the agriculture valuation change, and that's that first bullet. LB 338 was amended slightly to incorporate some ideas introduced by Senator Erdman in LB 602. But overall, our issue with this idea, although we're not opposed to switching to an income-based approach, at the end of the day, the fact that this has been incorporated into a much larger tax package, makes it pretty difficult for us to get behind. Tax cuts need to be triggered based on realized revenue, not projected revenue. To give you kind of an idea of what we mean by that, if the projected revenue, if the trigger is 3.5%, just so you know, we're expecting a $385 million shortfall over the next biennium, and currently the projections from the Tax Rate Review Committee, the forecasting board actually, will be are already at 5.5 or 5.6% over the next biennium. So that 3.5% trigger is really low, and it's going to hit every year, even when we're in a budget shortfall. We also want to make sure that at the end of the day, like I said before, that the new revenue, the sales taxes, spreading it out, making sure more people are paying, these are things that we want to see as part of this, that we're not just decreasing income taxes at the expense of property taxpayers, frankly, and that's what this bill does. This list hasn't changed a whole lot, but I just wanted to quickly remind everyone again that 640 will be up next week. It's coming up first. Depending on what happens, I think the overall agreement is that what happens on 461 is very much dependent on what happens on LB 640, how much amending we can do, the success or failure of that bill. Our count right now on LB 640 is, it varies quite widely. We're working very hard to help education understand where we're coming from and get on board. As part of our coalition work, Bruce has been working with the education community quite closely, and we're trying to bring them around on LB 640 to get more aid out to those rural schools that have no equalization dollars because ag values have gone up so much. LB 44, so everyone knows, that was actually passed yesterday on general file on a vote, I think, of 27 to 13 noes. So it passed by a pretty wide margin. There's a suspicion that it's going to, if we want to actually implement, this is the bill that taxes remote sellers. So currently, if you don't have a physical presence in the state of Nebraska, you technically, and you're selling online, you don't have to pay, you don't have to remit sales taxes. If you're purchasing that stuff from those remote sellers, you're supposed to be remitting the sales tax. No one does. And frankly, there's really not a lot of enforcement behind that. So this is basically asking very harshly if sort of like the state of Colorado and the state of South Dakota are doing for those actual retailers to collect and remit the sales tax. This is probably going to have to overcome a veto if we want to see it implemented, a governor's veto, which will need 30 votes to override the veto. We'll need 33 if they decide to filibuster it, which I'm not sure they will, but it's 30 to override the veto.
I have a question. Why is the governor going to veto new revenue? Why do you think that's going to happen? Because I've heard that too in news reports as well.
Sure. There's two reasons given generally. One is that any new tax, any quote-unquote new tax, if you're not paying taxes on something today and you're paying taxes on something tomorrow, that's a new tax. There's that thought out there, even though you're supposed to be paying it. It's not necessarily a new tax, it's supposed to be remitted today. The other issue is that the governor believes it's not constitutional, and there's a chance that we'll be relying on this revenue in the budget, and then it'll either get pulled back or it won't actually come through. And there are a couple things I think that we push back with a little bit, which is one, at first, since the Supreme Court hasn't acted, the fact of the matter is the Supreme Court is going to have to act on these laws because right now you're seeing states take matters in their own hands. And since Congress won't pass the Marketplace Fairness Act and the Supreme Court almost has refused to take these up, they did let the Colorado law stand, but they haven't actually officially ruled because 20 years ago in a Supreme Court case, they ruled that if you were a remote seller, you didn't have a physical presence, you didn't have to remit taxes. So right now, the Supreme Court has that case out there. It's going to take a Supreme Court decision to overturn that unless Congress was to act magically. The whole point of states doing this, though, is to get the Supreme Court to act faster. And my other argument is that until the Supreme Court acts, there isn't going to be a huge influx. There will be from Amazon because they've agreed to pay the taxes voluntarily. That'll be $70+ million. But from this remote seller's tax in the state, you're only going to see a couple $1 million flow in for the first 2 years because they're technically, I mean, even if they don't file suit, the suspicion is it's only going to be a couple $1 million. So it's not like we're going to bring in $100 million to the budget and plan for that and then it's going to be pulled back. The whole point is to get this on the books in the event the Supreme Court does act. And in the interim, it's good policy. It makes sense. It's a new economy. You should be paying sales taxes on these things. We should be enforcing that. And it's much fairer to our Main Street businesses.
That's a great explanation. I just was curious where he was standing on it, because I understand what you're saying now. Thank you.
Okay, that was kind of a long answer. But just so everybody knows, that has to go to select file now. It's got a couple more hurdles, so it's not necessarily law yet, but we're going to follow it closely and we'll keep everybody updated. LB 144 and LB 265 are two of Senator Friesen's bills that were prioritized by Senators Bosselman and Breezy. The reason we're still watching these is because they would actually, you know, they work in terms of property tax relief, and they're ideas that have been supported previously in terms of either decreasing ag land values under TIOSA to get more aid flowing out to rural schools, or the foundation aid concept, which kind of fell by the wayside in the TIOSA formula 20 years ago. We kept the equalization part. We have slacked off the foundation aid, and that's why we see so many unequalized school districts out there. Both of those ideas are going to be, at least I think, discussed next week. I don't know exactly. They're not going to be standalone bills. They might be amendments. You know, we need a backup plan, and we think that these two bills have some merit when it comes to backup plan. Just so everyone knows, the Appropriations Committee voted yesterday on the budget for 2017 to 2019, the biennial budget. 3 senators voted against the budget: Senators Watermeyer, Keene, and Clements, for different reasons. The full body will take up the budget this month, later in a couple weeks. And then just another FYI for everyone, they did pull dollars from cash funds, meaning a cash fund would include something. I mean, the property tax credit fund is a cash fund, but they didn't pull anything from that. But like the brand committee, I know, where it's a user fee fund, so a checkoff, for instance. Again, they didn't touch any checkoffs specifically, but they did pull $500,000, according to the committee, out of the brand committee cash fund. And that's something that we'll be talking to senators about and lobbying very hard. We don't like that precedent. Those are self-funded reserves. Often they're earmarked, even, you know, especially in the brand committee, the case of the brand committee, they're already earmarked for specific projects. And just so you know, we'll be working over the next few weeks. This is something we discussed a little last year. The natural resource districts are still looking at options to extend that 3-cent levy authority for fully or over appropriated districts. And that's something that we could see come back. We're still working to figure out a way forward there.